Thank you, Dr. Sodi. Uh, and my thanks to the RSTA organizing team for inviting me to deliberate on the topic of, we don't discuss that much in clinical practice also. That's a diabetic gastroparesis. So what is a diabetic gastroparesis? Let me, am I busy? My slides are visible?
Yes, sir. Visible. Visible.
Okay. Okay. So, what is diabetic gastroparesis? So, gastroparesis is a syndrome characterized by delayed gastric emptying
अच्छा
and
चलिए ठीक है
upper GI
तो
symptoms
अपना कल हम आएंगे तो कल देख कर फिर कर देंगे
that suggest but are not associated with gastric outlet obstruction. So, what it means that diabetic gastroparesis is a delayed gastric emptying with no sign and symptom of gastric. There is no physically, gastric outlet obstruction. Generally, gastroparesis is a complication which occurs in long-standing diabetes, and generally it is thought to be part of a broad spectrum of autonomic neuropathy, which involve cardiovascular system and, of course, GIT and genitourinary system. And the more appropriate term will be, or you can put it that diabetic gastroparesis, in fact, is a part of a broader term that we call as a diabetic gastroenteropathy. So it is not only the stomach which is involved, it's the duodenum, is the small intestine, it's the colon, which is also affected in diabetes. And it depends on the symptomatology. So if you have a symptoms dominating to the stomach, we call it diabetic gastroparesis. So I will be discussing it under following headings. That is first is the introduction, then pathophysiology of diabetic gastroparesis, what is the clinical presentation, differential diagnosis, diagnostic approaches, management and treatment, and then conclusion slide. Let me first admit this point that currently there's no standardized method to diagnose diabetic gastroparesis. And majority of the Indian institutes don't have that much capability or instrumentation to diagnose diabetic gastroparesis. So in my clinical practice, I rely more on the clinical presentation rather than investigation. Although currently we have mortality studies available in our institute, at that is Dhyanand Medical College and Hospital, but majority of the institute, they don't have that much instrumentation to for assessing the gastric mortality. And gastric mortality testing depends on various factors also. So it is not a gold standard also, although this is the only way you can diagnose it, but it's not the only method. You have to have the symptoms also, and then investigation suggestive of diabetic gastroparesis. So as I said, that diabetic gastroparesis is generally a part of the broader term, that is a diabetic gastroenteropathy. And gastroparesis means the gastric emptying is slowed down. So it's a complication of diabetes characterized by delayed gastric emptying without the mechanical obstruction. The symptoms include postprandial fullness, nausea, vomiting, bloating, and upper abdominal pain. And diabetic gastroparesis may result in dysglycemia. This is well documented that absorption is delayed if we have given insulin at the time of meal. So there will be mismatch because the contents, gastric content, are not released into the intestine and the duodenum to the intestine for absorption of the nutrients. So one can get hypoglycemia. Frequent hospitalization because of this only, that sometimes you have a hypoglycemia, at other times hyperglycemia, and then of course the other symptoms like nausea, vomiting, which are there, and then poor quality of life. And it is said that physical quality of life and mental quality of life both are affected with the diabetic gastroparesis. And physical quality of life is as bad as the patient with rheumatoid arthritis, and mental quality is bad than the rheumatoid arthritis patient, active rheumatoid arthritis patient. So they have a poor quality of life apart from hospitalization, frequent hospitalization. In fact, if you take all the gastro problems, then diabetic gastroparesis takes about the maximum of the financial budget of the patient. Be it even perforation is less costly as compared to the diabetic gastroparesis. So relationship between gastric emptying and symptoms of gastroparesis remain weak, leading to wide variation in the prevalence of gastroparesis in diabetes, up to 60%. So there was one study which was done in Rochester epidemiology project, which has shown that overall age-adjusted prevalence of definite gastroparesis. That means the patient has presented with the complaints and he is investigated from that. Per 1 lakh persons was approximately fourfold high in women as compared to men. This was 37.8 in 1 lakh population as compared to 9.6 in men. Then 21 of 83 patients which they have investigated on the scintigraphy and all those procedures, but having definite symptoms also, and studies which were suggestive of gastroparesis. Then the cumulative incidence of symptoms and delayed gastroparesis over 10 years was found in that study was 5% in type 1 diabetes and 1% in type 2 diabetes. There is another study that's a Allstate County study, which was a community-based study. Again, it does not show any difference between the normal population as well as in the diabetic population. But one study from Australia has said that there is a significant gastric emptying delaying in diabetes as compared to the normal population, more so in type 1 diabetes. So there is a wide variation because the recent, we have studies which are available. Only recently we came to know about the true prevalence or incidence of the study. Still, many things are unsaid about the true prevalence, because there are two types of things. Because majority of the patient, they may be asymptomatic for diabetic gastroparesis. They don't seek the hospitalization, or they don't come to the doctor with the complaints. This study, what I'm quoting is, the patient has presented with the gastroparesis symptoms. So many patients, almost 50% of the patient with diabetic gastroparesis, that's mild to moderate intensity, they don't come to the doctor with the complaints, or their complaints are very minor, and one can confuse it with diabetic dyspepsia plain. So cross-sectional study reviewing medical records reported the prevalence of 4.6 in type 1 diabetes and 1.3% in type 2 diabetes. And the problem is that only 14% had testing and documentation done. Only 14%. So those who have symptoms even, only 14%, because of the availability of the investigation armamentarium, only 4% had testing. So thereby diabetic gastroparesis is commonly undetected, and the real prevalence remains unknown, because a minority of the patient have gastric emptying measured, and even then diagnosis can be challenging, because there is some overlap between the mild, moderate, or meal test is not that perfect, and is not of that perfection. So what is the pathophysiology of diabetic gastroparesis? This is a disorder in which there is a gastric emptying is not proper. So gastric emptying not proper means, see, there are three parts in the stomach. One is body and the fundus of the stomach. Then we have antrum. Then we have a pylorus. And we have antrum can be divided into proximal or distal antrum. And the three parts of the stomach had differentiated functions to them. the fundus and the body has the function of storage of food and exposing the food to the acid. That's the most important function of the fundus and the body. The second part is that's the antrum. Antrum is muscular, all right, and it churns the food and pushes it, making it only 2 mm particle, small particle, pushing it through the pylorus into the duodenum. So first part, fundus and body, has a function of what function? It is the mixing of the food with the acid, and antrum has the function of churning the food and making it small particle, and then pylorus is the valvular kind of thing, from where the fluid goes into duodenum. So normally 2 calories or 3 calories, one contraction is shifting the fluid from the antrum to the duodenum through the pylorus. Now, what can lead to stasis of gastroparesis? You can say what can lead to. Number one, it can be that antrum is not properly working, antrum is not pushing the food, and secondly, the slow waves which come in the fundus, they are not that effective, so they are not pushing the food towards the antrum. So both ways, that the muscular layer is like that only, that circular layer of the muscle, they are very dominant, very prominent in antrum, and oblique muscles and the longitudinal muscles are more prominent in the fundus and the body. So control of these contractions in the fundus, antrum, as well as the pylorus relaxation is mediated through neural connections, which are of 2 types. One is extrinsic system, that is a parasympathetic, mediated by the vagal component. Another is sympathetic, right? Then the intrinsic system. Intrinsic system is very interesting. That we have 2 types of plexus. One is submucosal plexus, another is submuscular plexus or BAT, and another plexus which maintain. The submucosal plexus is important for the secretion and absorption throughout the gut, and the another plexus which is present in the muscular layers is responsible for the contraction. And over that, we have in that system we have a cells which we call as a interstitial cell of Kajal, that is a ICC, and these cells are very much important. There are almost 100 million neurons cells in the entire GIT, and these cells are very important because they are the pacemakers of the intestine, they are the pacemaker of the gut, and on that you have a neuronal control by vagal and sympathetic. So pacemaker sets the tone for contraction, and this tone may be different in different organs of the GIT. It may be different in the stomach, it may be different in the antrum, it may be different in the pylorus, it may be different, it will be different in duodenum as well as in the colon. So there are different factors. Over that, we have hormones also. There are various hormones like ghrelin, like motilin, like cholecystokinin, like VIP, and all those hormones are, we will be discussing later on when we will be discussing therapeutics. And what is said about the diabetic gastroparesis? Many studies have shown that probably it's a nervous system dysfunction. The vagal dysfunction is there. There are the studies which stated that there is a vagal dysfunction, but it's not truly proved. That many patients, they have a normal VIP responses to vagal stimulation, but still there is a gastroparesis. So what else can be there? Probably it's the problem with the interstitial cell of Kajal network. What we have found in diabetic gastroparesis full biopsies, what we found is that cell number is decreased. Interstitial cells of Kajal, they are decreased in diabetic gastroparesis patients. That means generally 1 to 2 cells per field as compared to 5 to 8 cells per field, which occur in the normal population. So that means that we are losing the interstitial cells of Kajal, and if you lose those cells, then probably networking is not proper. So if networking is not proper, then probably you don't have a systematic contractions of the gut, especially of the stomach, and systematic relaxation of the pylorus, because when the antrum is contracting, you have to have the relaxation of the pylorus. Only then the chyme, which is the product by the mixing of all the things, will be thrown into the duodenum, will be pushed towards the duodenum. So definitely there is a reduction in the interstitial cells of Kajal in case of diabetic gastroparesis. Then there is a loss of nitric oxide synthase expression. Then, of course, oxidative stress acting through heme oxidase system. So many factors has been related to that, but nervous system dysfunction and, of course, interstitial cells of Kajal network disturbances, this occurs in long-standing diabetes. But mind you, acute hyperglycemia will also produce the gastroparesis. Although when I was going through the studies, that certainly studies were favoring that hyperglycemia, and clinically also we think that hyperglycemia does produce gastroparesis. Definitely ketogenesis produce gastroparesis, but studies are plus minus for the role of hyperglycemia. Acute hyperglycemia definitely, but does chronic hyperglycemia lead to gastroparesis? Still, it's a plus minus kind of thing. So we have a different pathophysiology, but interesting is vagal dysfunction as well as the interstitial cells of Kajal network dysfunction. That is a very much important. What will be the clinical presentation of diabetic gastroparesis? As I said, those who are presenting, they are the tip of the iceberg kind of thing. Many patients, they have the diabetic gastroparesis, but still they don't have any symptoms or very mild symptoms. Certainly those who present with the present to the doctor with the symptoms, they have generally nausea and vomiting, then abdominal pain, which is a undefined kind of thing, maybe in the left upper abdomen, like early satiety and postprandial fullness or bloating. Then severe cases will have weight loss, and then of course hypoglycemia and postprandial hyperglycemia both can occur. Hypoglycemia occur in the early stage phase, right? In the early stage that you have given insulin, it will occur in the early stage because contents are not going, stomach contents are not going to the duodenum. Rather, they are going very late. Generally, liquids, they go to the stomach to the duodenum within 30 minutes, and solid food, they take their time. They take about 90 to 120 minutes. So this is how solid, they are not moving. So if you are given insulin over a period of time, within 2 hours, because food is not delivered or calories are not delivered, so there is a chance of hypoglycemia, early hypoglycemia. So postprandial hypoglycemia is another kind of thing. Then comes the quality of life. As I've already discussed, quality of life is quite bad in severe cases of gastroparesis. What is the differential diagnosis? Differential diagnosis, gastric outlet obstruction. Although this come into the when you diagnose a patient of gastroparesis, you have to rule out gastric outlet obstruction with endoscopy or imaging modalities. Then functional dyspepsia or indigestion, very difficult unless we do the studies of gastroparesis. Even functional dyspepsia, it is a 30-30 kind of thing. 30% of the patient with functional dyspepsia, they have gastric, they are slowing of the gastric emptying, not to the extent which is there in the diabetic gastroparesis. 30% are normal and 30% they have a increased gastric emptying. So this is the one of the diagnosis which is needs a exclusion by taking a good clinical history. Then gastroesophageal reflux disease. Contrary to the popular belief that diabetic gastroparesis will lead on to reflux, it's not so common. Gastroparesis does not lead on to reflux. And when there is a reflux, just think of gastroesophageal reflux there. Then we have psychiatric disease like anorexia and bulimia, the rumination syndrome. Rumination syndrome is one of the syndrome which occur in female commonly, and this is a effortless vomiting. That is a repeated effortless vomiting which occurs in young females, but more commonly in mentally disadvantaged children, and becoming more common in adolescent and adults presently. Then is cyclic vomiting syndrome. This is again, it's characterized by a recurrent episode of intense nausea and vomiting lasting from 3 to 5 days and happens every 3 to 4 months. Cyclical vomiting syndrome may be associated with menstruation or diabetes. Triggers are many, like sleep deprivation, infection, food, motion sickness, and medications, of course. And again, diabetic gastroparesis, when I was telling you what is the prevalence and the incidence, it's more common in females, and certainly rumination syndrome, psychiatric disease, they are more prevalent in anorexia, bulimia. It's more prevalent in the female population. Then another new thing is cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. This is they also experience episode of intense vomiting, but they present with this after prolonged excessive cannabis use, and there is a history of cannabis, and you stop it, the vomiting subsides automatically. Diagnostic approach for the diabetic gastroparesis, we have to rule out mechanical obstruction with the upper GI endoscopy series, a CT or MRI enterography. Then you have to get the gastric emptying test. That's best is gastric emptying scintigraphy studies. Then you have a gastric emptying breath test, then wireless motility capsule, and functional ultrasonography. And functional ultrasonography is the latest one. Motility capsule is being tried in the developed countries. We don't have that facility, but emptying scintigraphy and emptying breath test, they are available. So there are precautions to be taken before the test. The precaution includes that we have to stop all the motility altering medication like anticholinergic, opiates, or prokinetics should be withheld to ensure accurate results. And then certain therapies like GLP-1 receptor agonist and pramlintide, they are both the agents that decrease the motility of the stomach, so they have to be stopped. Then opiate analgesic, anticholinergic should be discontinued at least if the patient is taking at least 48 hours before the test. So this is how you do it. And with the egg white sandwich, low fat, as a test meal, at the end of 4 hours, more than 10% we call as delayed gastric emptying. Generally, it takes 2 hours. Generally, at 2 hours, there's no residual food into the stomach in a normal population. And at 2 hours, almost 70% is pushed towards the through the pylorus to the duodenum. Mild we call when it's a 10 to 15%, and moderate gastric paresis we call when it is 16 to 35%, and severe when it's more than 35% residual food in the stomach, we call it as a severe gastroparesis. How you manage these patients? Managing is first is lifestyle recommendation, and the lifestyle recommendation that we have to properly hydrate these patients, modify their diet, and remove possible medication or substances that could make their symptoms worse. What are the food or food which are affecting the gastric motility? What we have the studies have found that fatty, acidic, spicy, and roughage-based foods, they exacerbate the symptoms, while bland, sweet, salty, and starchy foods are tolerated well. Then avoidances of carbonated beverages and because they cause gastric distension, alcohol, and smoking, because they both decrease the motility of the stomach. They should be avoided at all. And so taking small frequent meals and without these, what I've said is a spicy fatty meal, avoidance of these will improve the symptomatology. That's in the lifestyle modification. And nothing can be more true than the glycemic control. We know that glycemic control improves the so many things, but let me tell you that late glycemic control in the history of diabetes does not improve the gastroparesis symptomatology. Then we have a prokinetic and antiemetic medication, and FDA has approved metoclopramide as one of the agent. This is increase the peripheral cholinergic activity and centrally acts as a dopaminergic antagonist at the chemoreceptor trigger zone. This is a very good medication. We have been using it. The only problem with this medication is probably dystonia, Parkinson type or tardive dyskinesia, which occurs in 1% of the population, and more commonly in female population, tardive dyskinesia. And this is a black box warning on this molecule also. So it improves the symptoms, but generally what is said is after some time, the effect weans off. So drug holiday is a one thing which has been told about the to be done with the metoclopramide. Then we have dopamine, then we have domperidone, then cisapride, which is discontinued because of the association with the prolonged QT interval. Then another agents like mortilin receptor agonist, in which we have erythromycin and azithromycin. But again, they can be used for a short term. That means 2 weeks. Thereafter, the effect weans off. And then ondansetron and phenothiazine may be used to relieve the symptoms. Then we have investigational treatment like ghrelin receptor agonist. They have been tried because ghrelin is one which increases the motility of the stomach. They have been tried, but in fact, there are a number of compounds while studying. There are almost 5-6 compounds with the ghrelin agonist, but results are not so encouraging. Then we have a neurokinin receptor antagonist, and the compound is aprepitant, which has been used. Again, the results are not that great. In the mild to moderate category, the results are good, but once you go to the severe gastroparesis, neurokinin receptor antagonist don't stand the test. And then prucalopride, there's one study which shows that it improves, but prucalopride is more of a increasing the motility of the colon, and it's more effective there. But one study has shown good result with the in gastroparesis also. Then Velocitrag and Motilide. Velocitrag is another 5-HT4 receptor antagonist, and it increases the gastric emptying. Still, we have not got the good results with it. Then Motiloids, then surgical intervention like enterostomy, pyloroplasty, and gastrojejunostomy, and gastric electrical stimulation. And GPOM is a gastric peroral endoscopic myotomy, has been tried to cut the fibers of the pylorus to facilitate the content going into the duodenum. To conclude, gastroparesis is a prevalent and debilitating complication of diabetes with significant physical, emotional, and financial burden. Tight glycemic control may suggest its presence. Diet modification and good glycemic control are fundamentals of therapy. Current medication have limited efficacy and have high risk of adverse events. Newer agents and procedure have shown some promise and need further studies. More research is required to establish safety and efficacy of therapy. Thank you.